Okay, the last slide deck in this unit, in our first unit. So I already talked about the difference between threats and attacks, or at least how I divided it for this course. And we talked about the art of war, knowing yourself and knowing the threats that you face. So let's talk about some of these attacks. And the first one that I found in the textbook that the textbook discusses is compromises to intellectual property. What exactly is intellectual property? Intellectual property are things like any information that you own would be intellectual property, or any copyrights or trademarks and things like that. Those are all intellectual property. One of the classic examples of protecting intellectual property for information systems is software licensing. If I write some software, I license it. And licensing isn't just, a lot of people think software licenses is the code that you type in before you can use the software. That's not really what we're talking about with software licensing. It's the agreement that you have with the developer of that software is the license, where you are licensed to use the software for a certain purpose, in a certain way, for a certain period of time, for a certain type of use, and so forth and so on. And a lot of times that software licensing is enforced through some kind of copy protection. And that's what when you're putting in that code, or when you're unlocking software and so forth and so on. Well, one of the threats to intellectual property is cracking software, jailbreaking software or operating systems, for example, and stealing those codes, basically. And I put here subject or object because this is an equal concern for most organizations in both directions. So, if I'm a company that develops software, one of my big concerns is going to be protecting my intellectual property by making sure that it's properly licensed. And that makes a lot of sense. It's very intuitive. But what about being the subject of intellectual property compromises? In other words, attacking that intellectual property. Now, most of you might be thinking, well, gee, no company is going to do that. But that's actually one of the most common things that companies do. So much so that there's organizations that make money basically on just auditing the usage of software and policing software pirating in business and industry. I'm sure some of you have heard of this, but if you work for a company, a lot of times in IT, you'll get a letter from one of these organizations that say, if you have information about a company using software without paying for that software, in other words, they're using pirated versions or stolen licensing or using too many licenses, more than they're supposed to be using, for example, they'll offer to give you a reward in order to turn them in. And then how are they funding that award? Because they go in and investigate the company, they audit them, and then they make them pay for all the licensing that they're not using, and that's an expense that they weren't expecting to pay. And it can have serious consequences for organizations. The example that's used in your book is a community college in Las Vegas, Nevada, that an anonymous tip was sent to one of those auditing organizations that they were using software from Microsoft without licensing. Because of their agreement with Microsoft, they had to allow an audit from Microsoft. They found that the majority of their computers were not paying for the licenses for Windows and for Office and so forth. And they hit that college with millions and millions of dollars in fees. And it had a significant impact in their budgets and their ability to provide service to those students. So that could be a major threat to our organization. So we want to make sure that we are properly complying with software licensing to make sure that we do not have to pay those fees and those fines for violating those agreements. And that's kind of hard to do because a lot of, it's very easy to install software without a license. I mean, everybody's done it. I mean, I'm sure none of you guys who are listening to this have ever pirated software, right? Happens all the time. Everybody does it, it seems like. I'm not going to say I've done it, but it seems like everybody's doing it. So it's so commonplace, and it seems, there's nothing wrong with doing it is how a lot of people look at it. And even to the point, another good point here is employees downloading movies and music and things like that. If people are using your network to pirate movies and music and so forth and so on, it could be argued that you're complacent in that, and that could certainly be a problem and a threat to the organization. So intellectual property is an important concern. Hacking. In my opinion, the term hacking is one of the most misused terms. Everybody uses it to describe the bad guys that are attacking your systems. And one of the things that I always like to mention about hacking, and I think it's really important for a student in this program and who's taking IT security to understand the term hacker does not always mean the bad guys. Just to give you a little background, the term was coined at MIT in the 1950s, and it was used to describe somebody who was who had a lot of technical aptitude, who liked to tinker, who liked to experiment, who was especially good at figuring things out. That was what a hacker was. And if you think that it's a bad thing to be a hacker, I would disagree with you. I think if the definition of a hacker is the original definition from MIT in the 1950s, then I think all of us should strive to be a hacker. But if I went and told somebody that I'm a hacker, if I saw somebody on the street and they said, "What do you do?" and I say, "Oh, I'm a hacker," they're going to think that I'm that guy that's trying to steal money out of their bank account in the middle of the night, right? Because a lot of people don't know that term. So the media has really hijacked the term hacker, and it's come to mean something else. And I mention it here because I think it's, one thing I like to stress is that experimenting and trying to understand how things work, these are not necessarily bad things. And I think it's a good trait. So when in IT security, we usually, years ago in IT security, we used to refer to the bad guys as crackers. So the guys that we're going to, and could be girls, I suppose, but it's mostly guys between the ages of 17 and 23 are usually the ones attacking things. But we used to use the term cracker, and then it became commonplace to use the term attacker. But I think at some point we all gave up and we just call everybody a hacker. Even though the term hacker is kind of vague because it's not always necessarily a bad thing to be a hacker. But hackers are these typically referred to as the people that do these attacks, that carry out these attacks, that try to steal data and so forth and so on. But like I said, they're not always necessarily the bad guys. And I would consider myself a hacker if you use the original definition. So some of the techniques that hackers use, one of the things your book talks about is the primary goal of an attacker is to compromise data and to compromise some system in order to get information or to get into a system. And the best way to do that is to get passwords. And some of the tools that we have to crack passwords is brute force, where we simply try every combination to try to break a password. Another one is password cracking. We can use dictionary cracks, which is where we try known possible passwords from a dictionary file. And a dictionary doesn't necessarily mean that they're real words. They're just things that are commonly used as passwords, for example. So there's all these collections on the internet of common passwords that hackers will use to try to break passwords. Another common one is rainbow tables, where, one of the challenges for attacking passwords is passwords are typically stored as a hash. They use and we'll learn more about hashing later on in this course. It has a lot to do with integrity and so forth, but it's it's one of the encryption topics, but basically it takes a lot of computational energy or a computational effort to create the password hash to compare it to the hash that's stored in, say, a password file in a Unix system, for example. So instead, a rainbow table is a pre-compiled list of passwords that are already hashed, that you already have, that algorithm's already been done for you. So it can make cracking passwords much faster. And typically, attackers will use a hybrid of a number of these techniques to find out what passwords are. But with all these techniques that are available to hackers, or I should say to attackers, to somebody who's trying to do harm, of all these different techniques that are available, probably the easiest and most common is just to ask somebody for their password, which is social engineering. Social engineering, you could probably take a whole course on social engineering. It's a fascinating topic. We don't cover it in much detail in this course, but we do cover it in CT 420 and a few of the other courses in the program. But social engineering is an interesting technique, but basically you're trying to trick people into giving them information, into giving you information. So you can almost think of social engineering as being like a scam artist. But it's surprisingly easy to social engineer. One of the most famous social engineers is a fellow by the name of Kevin Mitnick. And I think I asked you in the practical assignment just a nice soft beginning to the course here, is to look into who Kevin Mitnick is and what he did, and kind of look into how he did social engineering. In my opinion, social engineering is one of the hardest threats we have to protect ourselves from, because social engineering isn't attacking a system. It's not attacking a technology. It's not, trying to crack a system, with a keyboard and all that stuff. Social engineering is using people as the vulnerability. As I talked about before, people are a huge vulnerability. They make mistakes. They make errors. It's very difficult to cultivate a culture where people are impervious to social engineering. We'll talk more about this in our unit on IT security policy and governance. We're going to talk more about how we can protect ourselves from social engineering, but it's certainly one of the hard things to protect ourselves from, because people are very difficult to control. Another example of an attack is extortion. This is becoming much more common. Years ago, we didn't really talk about extortion with any degree of seriousness in IT security courses, but now this has become a major concern. You've probably heard the term ransomware. And what happens here is you have malware, and we'll talk more about malware here in just a few minutes, but you've got malware that basically takes your data hostage and you have to pay a fee to get your data back. And this is one of the big issues we're dealing with in IT security right now, that IT security managers are trying to figure out when our data is the victim of ransomware. Do we pay the ransom to get our data back, or do we not pay the ransom? My recommendation to in this area is never to pay the ransom, just like the U.S. government, right? Never pay the ransom, because it's only going to make the problem worse. But a lot of people are tempted to pay it, and they're very smart. These attackers that do ransomware, they know how they have algorithms that look at the importance of the data. They kind of figure out how important it is, how much is there, and try to figure out how much is going to be worth it for that person to get their data back. So if you are working on a term paper and you're the victim of ransomware, and you've been working on this term paper all semester, all quarter, it's the end of the quarter, it's time to turn the paper in, somebody encrypts the file, you don't have a backup, and tells you for $100 you can get the file back, I think a lot of you would be tempted to pay the $100 instead of doing all that work over again. So again, that's become a very big threat recently, ransomware. Sabotage and vandalism. When we talk about sabotage and vandalism, we're usually talking about hacktivism. Website defacement is a big trend that's been happening. Anonymous has been very quiet lately. As I'm recording this, it's been a while since we've seen any anonymous attacks, but they were very big on hacktivism and website defacement and stealing data for hacktivism and maybe releasing it to WikiLeaks or something like that. But that's another major concern and another avenue of attack. Software attacks. You have worms, viruses, Trojan horses, rootkits, and spyware. Really, Trojan horses, rootkit, and spyware can all be defined as a type of virus or worm. But let me go back to worm and viruses. One important thing I want you to take away from this course right now about software attacks, about worms and viruses, is that a worm, let me take a step back. A virus is malware that, in order for it to damage your system, in order for you to get a virus, you have to have some contact with that virus. You have to do something to get a virus. You have to open a file. You have to download that file. You have to open an attachment in an email. You have to insert a USB drive or something in order to get a virus. You have to somehow acquire that file. A worm is very similar to a virus. Worms, at the end of the day, whether it's a worm or a virus, it's going to be a Trojan horse, a rootkit, spyware, or some other category of malware that's doing some harm to your computer, your files. But like I said, a virus, you have to do something to get a virus, where what makes a worm unique is that you don't have to do anything except be connected to the network. Worms spread on their own. One thing you can look up that's a fascinating case of a worm is Stuxnet. Go to Wikipedia and do a search for Stuxnet. Pause this video right now and go take a look at Stuxnet. Trust me, it'll be worth your time if you've never heard of it. It's a fascinating example of a worm, and it's a fascinating example of how there's a lot of factors in Stuxnet. But go and take a look. I don't want to waste time talking about it in the presentation, but it's certainly something that's interesting to take a look at. So again, the big takeaway here is that worms spread themselves. Viruses, you have to do something to get a virus. So worms are a huge concern because our users don't even know when they get a worm. A lot of people get worms and they don't even realize they have them. So it's certainly a major concern. But viruses, they're still bad. But the one nice thing about a virus is you did something to get it. So most people have some inkling that they got the virus. They opened an attachment and nothing happened, or they opened an attachment and all of a sudden things stopped working, or something just didn't seem right, or whatever. But again, it's important to understand the distinction between a worm and a virus. And we'll talk more about that a little bit under risk assessment and some of the other topics in this course. And I'll try to upload to Blackboard some additional materials that are optional that you could look at about worms and viruses. And then finally, we have theft. There is physical theft. Somebody walking out with your equipment is certainly one type of attack. Data theft, where the attacker is trying to steal your data. And this is extremely common. This is one of the biggest IT security concerns right now, is people stealing credit card numbers, customer data. If any of that stuff is compromised, it can cost a tremendous amount of money for our company, and it costs a tremendous amount of PR issues. If your company was the victim of a hack and lost a whole bunch of customers' data, and you have to notify those customers because there are laws that require us to do that. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the law and so forth and so on, and ethics and so forth in the next unit. That can certainly cost us a lot in money, and it can cost a lot in our image. And of course, it's not good for anyone for this data to get stolen. Nobody wants their credit card numbers to get stolen, or their medical records, or what have you. And no matter how benign you think records are, there's always some value to those records. I work in healthcare, and a lot of people say, why do we have HIPAA? Who cares about medical records? What's somebody going to do with medical records? But you would be surprised at how valuable medical records are. There's so much information in medical records that can be used by attackers. Medical records contain a lot of financial history. It's what I call a soft target. Most people think, well, I don't want hackers to attack my bank account, but who cares if they get my medical records? But they don't realize that there's a lot of information in there that you can use to get to your financial records. If somebody knows a lot of information about you, then they can certainly attack those other records. So it's certainly, these are all concerns. So no matter how benign you think those records are, there's always some nugget in there that's going to be valuable to an attacker. So again, that's data theft. So that's it for this unit. And stay tuned for the next unit. And of course, if you have any questions or concerns, let me know. And thank you for getting to the end of the presentation.